I spent this year looking at the effects that learning a second language can have on your first language in the terms of your lexicon. So a little terminology. Your L1 is your first language, your L2 is your second language, and lexicon are all the words that you know. So background. So L1 to L2 transfer is very well documented, but it's less so when you look at the L2 to the L1. So a study that's in the same vein of what I'm doing that looks at L2 to L1 transfer is Pavlenko and Malt 2011. So she looked at a drift in L1 lexicon for Russian-English bilinguals. So she looked at this, which is a cup in English, but would be called a krushka in Russian because it's a cup in English because of what it can contain, whereas in Russian it's a krushka because it's a tapered object. So then she looked at this thing in the middle, which would be for us a mug because it has this little handle and it houses warm things. Whereas in Russian, it'd be a chashka because it's made of porcelain and it's straight down. So there's a problem because in English, if you translate the English word cup to Russian, the direct translation is chashka, even though they don't really refer to the same thing. So she found that over time, with more input from L1, from English, the L1 Russian speakers were likely to start calling this a chashka instead of the krushka because of this influence from English. So I did something in this vein where I looked at false friends and cognates in this scale. So a false friend is something that's a formal similarity but no semantic overlap to English. So an example of this would be French formation, which is similar to, which means education in English, but it looks like this English word formation. And on the other end of the scale, we have cognates, which has a formal similarity and a complete or almost complete semantic overlap. So an example of this from French would be famille, which looks like family in English and means family in English. So I wanted to look at something in the middle of these two things. So they would have a formal similarity and then some semantic overlap, but not complete. So an example of that would be histoire in French, which means story in English, but it looks like this English word history. So how this works. So I wanted to look at histoire and history, which have some overlap right here. They both are like timeline and events, and they have some ordering to it. But in English, history has this connotation of like nonfiction and in the past, and it's already happened, whereas histoire has this connotation of like being a story or fiction. So I want to look at when the word history can be used in these two settings that history in English couldn't be. So I want to know if there's an impact on the knowledge of, is there an impact of L2 knowledge on your L1 lexicon, even at lower levels of exposure to the L2? And I'm looking to further support the theory of L2 influencing the L1, determine when this change becomes significant, and see if immersion is necessary for early stage lexical diversion from the L1 norm. So my profile, I had 37 participants who were mostly college-aged. They were divided into self-rated proficiency, novice, intermediate, advanced, and then I divided them based on their exposure to French into low, medium, and high exposure groups. Most had collegiate French experience, and 19 of them had studied or lived abroad at some point. So my methodology, I did an untimed online survey that had 30 acceptability judgment tasks, which included 5 cognates, 5 false friends, and 20 of those test items. And then I gave them a background questionnaire to understand their French experience and what kind of attitude they had towards French, and then I looked at it statistically. So examples of the questions would be something like, John said to Bill, do you want to go to a piece of theater on Friday night? And Bill replied, yes, let's get dinner as well. Where the test item would be piece of theater because it looks like pièce de théâtre, which is an expression in French, which means something equivalent to show. And then for an example for a false friend would be Haley was pleased with her acceptance in a nursing school because she knew she'd be able to get a job based on the school's reputation for providing a good formation, where formation is the word used. And then a cognate would be she looked forward to going home for the holidays because she'd be able to see her family, where family is the cognate. So the last two would be last one would be acceptable to all English speakers. The middle one would be probably wrong to all English speakers because it's just not correct. And then the first one is what I'm testing because piece of theater to some people would be correct and to some people wouldn't be, hopefully with influence from French. So my hypothesis is that the more proficient a participant is in French, the more willing she'll be to accept English words in semantically French settings, and that the more exposure a participant has to French, the more willing she'll be to accept words in semantically French settings. So what I found. So this is looking at, on the y-axis, you're looking at the acceptability, where 1 is the least acceptable and 6 is the most acceptable. And on the x-axis, you're looking at the level of proficiency based on group. So you have your novice, intermediate, and advanced. And then on the scale, you have the blue squares are cognates, the black triangles are false friends, and the red circles are test items. So I found that across the groups, the cognates are the most likely to be accepted, which is what you would expect because these are things that sound the same and they look the same in English. And the false friends are the least likely to be accepted, which is what you would expect because these don't have any semantic overlap in English, so they would be odd overall. And we found that the patterning of the test items overall is in the middle between these two, which is kind of what we were looking for. And you see that with the novice, they're the least likely to accept these test items, and that they actually are accepting them about the same amount as they accepted the false friends, which had no semantic overlap. So they're not accepting these things at all. They think these are very unnatural. Whereas the advanced learners are accepting them on a much higher, they're accepting them easily in between the two, and their average mean is a 3.66, whereas the novice average mean is a 2.97. So there's a break there. And the p-value is a 0.0935, so while it's not statistically significant, it's a good trend in the direction of being statistically significant. So based on exposure, again, we have the y-axis is the acceptability, where 1 is the least acceptable and 6 is the most acceptable. The x-axis has the groups based on their level of L2 experience, so the low, medium, and high. And then cognates are the blue squares still, false friends are the black triangles, and the test items are the circles in between. So again, the cognates and the false friends pattern as we expected, where cognates are the most acceptable and false friends are least acceptable, and the test items, again, kind of fall in between. Based on exposure, you see that the high mean for the high exposure group is a 3.37, whereas the mean for the low exposure group is a 3.06. And the mid-mean is actually a 3.02. So its pattern's a little bit differently, and it's a little weird, but you still see that the high group is the one that's accepting these the most, and the low group is the one that's accepting these the least. The p-score for this is a 0.7013, so it's not as statistically significant. It's not as much of a predictor, basically, based on how much exposure they've had. It's not as much of a predictor than how proficient they feel in the language, is what this is showing. So, conclusions. There is a positive relationship between advanced proficiency and acceptability, and a positive relationship between high exposure and acceptability, which means that advanced proficiency and high exposure will link to a higher acceptability. And implications and for future directions. So that implies that there is an impact of exposure to the L2 even at this lower level of learning where these people are not in an immersion setting. So that immersion might not be necessary for the L2 impact onto the L1. It said that an item type is a strong indicator of how participants will view the acceptability of an item. So whether it's a cognate or a false friend or a test item is indicative of how acceptable that item will be to the participant. Ultimately, though, it says more research needs to be done just based on the low numbers of people. With more people, hopefully the trend would become more statistically significant. So thank you so much. Are there any questions? Yes.
So I happen to be a Russian English bilingual, and I'm routinely blamed by my students for mixing up idioms between the two languages. So, and I have tons of questions, but I'll ask it too. 1, has there been any research on trilinguals? 2, this affects, as far as I understand it, metaphoric language, correct or no?
What do you mean by metaphoric language?
Language that goes on the diachronic sort of axis. So you borrow images, right? It's a metaphor, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll answer your first question first. So L3 trilingual studies are growing. It's even less commonly researched than L2 things. So I think that there's been some research that's done, but it's definitely like a growing body of research. And then as for metaphoric,
because I think that's where you trip up, right? Because in one language, one metaphor is acceptable, and in another it doesn't.
Sure.
It's not, sorry.
Well, I suppose like if you think of looking at a cup as like the different things that make up that cup, so whether it's like houses a warm object versus whether it houses a cool object as being metaphoric, then yeah, I guess it would be metaphoric. But in terms of like these are like kind of just the small little meanings that make up this bigger meaning, then if you view that as like a concrete, tangible thing, then this would be a concrete and tangible. Yeah. So I think it just depends on how you view those two things. Yeah.
So in your study, French is the L2. Right?
Yes.
So then when you did your testing, why did you test on their like why were the questions in French instead of English if you're testing the impact of learning French on the data?
Oh, they were in English. Sorry, the examples of the questions I gave were those were pulled exactly from the survey. Yeah, it was all in English. Yeah.
Thank you very much for doing this work. I think it's very important. I think with an increasing globalization, there are more and more people learning a second language, so we really need to understand these processes more. I was thinking, like, so here you're really in a sense selecting on the dependent variable, right? You chose a word in which you knew that there might be confusion, right? But that's a very small part of the overall language structure, right? And so I was interested in the fact that on your graph it seems as though there's also a downward trend for those words that should be acceptable, as though those people learning a second language also, you know?
Yeah, you mean in terms of the
Yeah,
cognates at the top?
You have one back, one forward, right?
Uh-huh.
So if you go this next slide.
Yeah.
So it's nearly as though there's a downward trend there for the triangles. I was just thinking about the overall effect on, when we think about language acquisition, yes, one thing is looking at these one words that, like, yes, there might be confusion here, but what does learning a second language mean for the overall, comprehension and ability to understand, and maybe the effect even on things, it might be more stringent with certain things that doesn't make sense in any of the languages, right?
Yeah.
Which is what this implies to me a little bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
When I learn the second language, when there's consistency across the two languages, I become more stringent, in the things that violate a rule. But if the two languages have different rules, it might become more lenient.
Yeah, it's, I think that I did see kind of a downward trend with the false friends. It wasn't statistically significant, but it is interesting that you do see that there's also, even within the false friends and the cognates, there is a line or a linear progression a little bit between the two. So, yeah, there more research needs to be done into what more actually happens. Yeah.
So, like the ability to learn language, like it changes over time. Like, and you have a critical period for language development. So I was wondering, when were these people getting most of their exposure to L2? Was it like at childhood, or was it like they were learning it at the school level, say in grade school or primary school?
So it really depended on the person. There was a participant who had learned it, from childhood, was immersed in it, in like bilingual education, and there were other participants who had just started learning it the year before. So it really depends on the participant. It was pretty varied. Awesome.
All right,
Thank you so much.